and racial consciousness did to black people. Martin Delany, probably the first black nationalist in America, in speaking on the elevation of the Negro, said that black people were singled out simply as a way to unify and unite various European groups who were immigrating to America. Because what they wouldn't tell you is that when the Europeans would immigrate to America, they would start fighting over here just like they did in Europe. But what organized them and galvanized them and brought them into a sense of solidarity was the fact that you had a Negro, a black, who did not look like any of the Europeans. Therefore, Martin Delany said that it was easy to target black people, easy to clump back black people into one group. And it was most befitting and very convenient to use the black person as the whipping boy and the stepping stone. And so the reason why, and this is so important, that African Americans regain their culture is because when you deal with people who are not of your culture, they feel they have a right to exploit you. They feel that they have a right to harm you or to do things to you that they normally wouldn't do to one of their kindred. So the concept of social Darwinism is well ingrained, and it was ingrained in the theories of a lot of the court cases that came out during Reconstruction, which led to Jim Crow. I just want to give you the name of some of the cases. You have the infamous and the very influential and the very important slaughterhouse cases in Louisiana, the Butchers Benevolent cases, the Colfax case. Why are these cases so important? These cases are important because they push the idea of economic conservative social Darwinism. Those words, those very words are written in the dicta of several of the court cases and in the recent commentaries that have been published in books like this, Constitutional Law and Politics. I want to read to you just a little bit of it. This is dealing with the Butchers Benevolent case. It says the country's economic expansion in the late 19th century was reinforced by the intellectual currents of conservative social Darwinism. So what was motivating the takeover of the blacks by the whites? How could you have the creation of the Ku Klux Klan and the Ku Klux Klan be able to grow by leaps and bounds when you had law enforcement, when you had certain legislation, federal legislation, that should have prevented it? How could you have black people lynched and murdered and denied the right? Why do you need a Voting Rights Act of 1965 if blacks got the right to vote in 1865? See, these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. How could these things happen? The reason why these things happen is because of conservative social Darwinism. These people believed that. They believed in the survival of the fittest, that the strongest have the right to undermine and subdue those whom they feel are weaker. And it says the philosophy of the survival of the fittest as applied to social and economic relations and perpetuating the myth of rugged individualism and laissez-faire capitalism. Isn't it interesting? Oh, isn't it funny when people talk, and I love to hear our Tea Partiers and other people talk about individual rights and talk about free capitalism and small government. Do you know those words are just code words? Do you know those phrases have a meaning that is hidden in the subjugation and the destruction of black people? Do you know those words are lifted directly from the pages of Jim Crowism and segregationism and egalitarianism and utilitarianism? Those words are lifted from there. So when we talk about small government means this. It means that if you get a mob together and that mob has relatives in government, that mob can get away with whatever they want to get away with. That's small government in a T. They don't want federal intervention simply because historically in America, the federal government, when it oversees the process, has always come out in favor of black people. Black people, right after slavery, built for themselves schools, began to build for themselves a future, and all of that was done under the protection of the federal government. But when Rutherford B. Hayes pulled his people out of the South, and as a way of compromising with Southern Democrats, that's when Jim Crow began. That's when the lynchings began, and that's when you saw the destruction of the Black Power base, which was building itself. So in lectures to come, we're going to go more in depth in some of the things that we've talked about. We're going to talk about Cruikshank versus the United States and the language that came out. We're going to talk about Dred Scott case. We're going to even talk about the Haitian Revolution and the impact that the Haitian Revolution had on what would later be known as American democracy, if you want to call it that. Did you not know that the word liberty in and of itself was never defined in a court of law until after slavery? Who are we dealing with? We don't have definitions, firm definitions before us. And so these words are still nuances of ambiguity. Nobody knows what they mean. But yet and still, people can perpetrate like they're so for America when we know what they're about. Because what they're about is written in the annals of the lost history of black people. The reason why we don't study these things is because if we don't study them, we won't be familiar with them, and we will not be able to recognize them when they occur. So in videos to come, hopefully if it be the Lord's will, we will be able to discuss these things. But I want you to think about these. I want you to think about this. What happened to black people? Why were black people subject to? Why did we have to have a civil rights movement to begin with? What allowed things to degenerate to that state? And is it possible? I know it may sound strange. I know it may sound crazy. But is it possible for history to repeat itself? Is it possible for us to be headed or for us to be retrogressing? Whites took a look at the blacks that were in power and said, no way. And they put on the sheets, they got the guns, and they took back over what they thought was their country. I know it sounds uncomfortable for us to talk in these terms, but we're simply going into the history. We don't have any racist motives or any racial intentions, and we are as sincere with others as they are with us. We don't have to fabricate anything because we've got enough history, and we will be given documentation. And as you can see, we don't do anything but make reference to books, make reference to articles. And the subject matter that we bring up, you can bring up for yourself. But we do want to share with you those things that have happened in history. And I want to put a little timeline on the board to give you an idea of some things. Now, the Civil War ended in 1865. That's the date that most people use to identify with the granting of rights to black people. But you'll find that in history, a term is used called freedmen to define black people who are no longer in slavery. Why freedmen and not citizens? Well, because the question of whether black people are citizens has always been a very controversial one. So now we see why educating blacks would be so controversial. Now we'll see why blacks in the military didn't get worked out until the mid to late 20th century. Now we see why we need civil rights bills and voting rights bills and so forth. Because although they had rights under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the question was, those apply to the federal government, but not to individual states.